Imagine descending from an amphibious boat only to be immediately greeted by thousands of cartridges burying themselves in the sand. Your comrades are just as terrified as you are, some so much that they can't move from fear. The rain of projectiles annihilates hundreds of people in seconds, their bodies falling riddled with lead. Gradually, the seawater turns red with the blood of your fellow soldiers. This might sound like a scene from a war movie, but it is what over 2 million Allied troops experienced during the Normandy landings, the offensive that condemned the Third Reich. In this military history feature, we want to reconstruct the events of those fateful days, bathed in blood and machine gun cartridges. It will be a colorful journey like you've never seen before. Let's begin with this spectacular video. The Normandy landings were the culmination of a long process that began in June 1940. At that time, the Battle of France ended with a victory for the Third Reich. This was considered by Adolf Hitler as the most famous victory in history. After a rapid advance that devastated the French army, German troops marched across French soil like kings, dominating one of the most important nations on the continent.
6 a.m., June the 28th. Hitler enters the defeated French capital.
Within barely 6 weeks of heroic struggle, our soldiers have ended the war in the West. Their deeds will enter into history as the most glorious victory of all time.
After this event, and the rescue of British troops who had been trapped in Dunkirk, the military leaders of the United Kingdom came to a grim conclusion. Even with the help of other Commonwealth nations and the United States, it would not be possible to liberate continental Europe in the near future. The Third Reich had won the first major round of World War II. After the Nazis began their invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Joseph Stalin began pressing the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe, which would significantly weaken the Third Reich. Winston Churchill dismissed the idea because, even with American support, he felt that the British lacked the necessary forces for such a large-scale offensive and wanted to avoid potentially disastrous frontal assaults. Nevertheless, Stalin's proposal was inevitable.
But secret planning for a major assault on Western Europe has begun in earnest. Throughout 1943, the Allied leaders meet in a series of conferences to plan the route to victory.
The decision to invade northern France across the English Channel was made during the Trident Conference, held in May 1943 in Washington. Churchill preferred that the Allied push focus from the Mediterranean, but this proposal was rejected by the Americans, who were providing most of the troops and material. British Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan was appointed Chief of Staff, that is, Supreme Allied Commander, with the important mission of devising a detailed plan. Operation Overlord was the name assigned to the ambitious project that, if successful, would represent the largest amphibious assault in history. But prior to the landing, and with the goal of achieving the necessary air superiority to ensure success, the Allies planned a bombing campaign. Its aim was to destroy German aircraft production, fuel supplies, and airfields. Thus, communication infrastructures, roads, and railways were bombed to isolate northern France and hinder the Third Reich's ability to send reinforcements. These attacks were orchestrated in a scattered manner to avoid giving precise clues about the landing locations. Additionally, impressive diversionary maneuvers were planned to prevent the Nazis from discovering the place and date of the Allied offensive. In war, surprise is undoubtedly the best weapon.
Britain becomes a vast military camp in preparation for Operation Overlord. Allied troops gather from Poland, France, Canada, and the United States. The long wait begins.
Between April 1944 and the landing, the Allied Expeditionary Air Force conducted 3,200 reconnaissance flights. Low-altitude photographs were taken of the coast to map the terrain, obstacles on the beaches, and defensive structures like bunkers and machine gun nests. To avoid giving clues to the Germans about the exact location, the flights were spread along the entire Atlantic coast of Europe. Aerial images were also captured inland of bridges, military unit locations, and buildings, often from different angles to gather as much information as possible. The Normandy coast was divided into 17 sectors, each given a code name using a word alphabet. From Abel, west of Omaha Beach, to Roger on the eastern flank of Sword Beach. When the invasion plan was expanded to include the Cottonton Peninsula and Utah Beach, 8 more sectors were added. These coastal sections were further divided into beaches identified by colors: green, red, and white. Before moving on to the brutal battles, let's briefly review the objectives of each force. The initial mission was to capture the towns of Caen, Carentan, Isigny, and Bayeux, and then advance inland to eliminate German soldiers. The Americans assigned the dangerous Utah and Omaha beaches, prioritized isolating the Cottonton Peninsula and capturing the port facilities of Cherbourg. The British, through Sword and Gold beaches, and the Canadians, on Juno Beach, were to capture Caen, establish airfields nearby, and create a battlefront to protect the American flank. Washington estimated that the fighting would last for 3 months and the operation would end when all forces reached the Seine River. To achieve this, constant training in amphibious operations was crucial.
Rehearsals and training for an amphibious and airborne assault are endless. Fears about the real thing grow as the weeks pass.
The concerns of the young Allied soldiers were justified, as they faced an unrelenting enemy. The Nazi armed forces, known as the Wehrmacht, had 50 divisions deployed in France and the Netherlands, and another 18 in Denmark and Norway. 15 more divisions were being assembled in Germany, but there was no strategic reserve to defend Normandy. Combat casualties throughout the war, particularly against the Soviet Union, had left Hitler's country without young men to recruit. Many of the soldiers stationed by the Third Reich in Normandy were Ostlegionen, or Eastern Legions, made up of recruits or volunteers from Turkestan, Russia, Mongolia, and other areas. They were armed with captured equipment and lacked motorized transport. Units that arrived later, such as the 12th SS Panzer Division of the Hitler Youth, were mostly composed of better equipped and trained youths compared to the rest of the troops stationed along the coast. After a year of planning the operation, D-Day, that is, the landing day, was marked on the calendar for June 5th. It was considered the most likely date to have calm waters, a full moon, and low tide with the first rays of sunlight. However, storms forced a one-day delay, so the troops finally mobilized on June 6th. Starting at 6:30 a.m., the first 5 assault divisions were taken to beaches protected in the rear by naval gunfire. The power of the cannons shattered the silence of a calm morning, turning it into a true hell. The collaboration of the Royal Navy was crucial. Initially, the cannons damaged the German positions, destroying several bunkers and stations from which they could fire at the coast. Then, once the waves of troops began to land, the fire continued to cover the men and allow them to plant their flag on those perilous sands. Omaha, the best defended sector, was assigned to the 1st U.S. Infantry Division, supplemented by other troops. There, they faced a brutal opponent, the 352nd Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht. Strong sea currents forced many landing craft to disembark east of their intended points, which seriously complicated the assembly of the troops once they hit the shore. Due to the relentless fire coming from the tops of the cliffs, the casualties on this beach far exceeded the sum of those recorded in the rest of the operation.
Barely on the beach, the men were greeted by an almost intact German defense. It was like a turkey shoot.
The German resistance was brutal. American soldiers disembarked from the Higgins boats, but were met with a hail of bullets coming from the dunes. There, hidden, were thousands of Germans equipped with artillery, mortars, and MG-42 machine guns. In the early moments of the landing, desperate situations arose. The soldiers were unclear on how to escape the fire. Once they hit the sand, they found themselves in a shooting gallery where they were the prey. They had to run to find some form of cover from which to plan their next move. The scene was stained with the blood of fallen men. It was a hellish panorama. Problems navigating the coastal obstacles led to a halt in the arrival of new landing craft at 8:30 a.m. Around that time, a group of destroyers approached to provide artillery support. The capture of this beach was only possible through 5 ravines, and by the end of the morning, only about 600 men had reached the higher ground. The rest had been brutally annihilated. By noon, when the naval bombardment had taken its toll and the Germans were running out of ammunition, the Americans managed to clear some paths. However, the objectives set for the first day of the invasion were not achieved until 3 days later. It is no wonder that Omaha became a symbol of the sacrifice of the troops and the suffering they endured to defeat the Third Reich. Despite the complications and with much blood and sweat, the Americans captured a precarious beachhead that they expanded with determination in the following days. Every meter was fiercely contested. The initial advance was slow and painful, making those first days after the landing seem endless. Meanwhile, on Gold Beach, the story was quite different. Strong winds complicated the arrival of Allied troops, and the amphibious tanks landed near the coast, though the plan was to do so at more distant points. Air attacks had not managed to destroy the Le Hamel fortification, and its powerful 75mm cannon continued firing until 4 p.m., though it gradually ran out of ammunition. The constant arrival of reinforcements overwhelmed any attempt at defense by the Germans. On the western flank, the Royal Hampshire Regiment captured the town of Arromanches and, on its eastern side, established contact with Canadian forces. Slowly, that pincer's movement began to close. The landing on Juno Beach was delayed due to rough seas, and the troops arrived before the anti-artillery protection ships, which led to enemy fire, causing numerous casualties among the soldiers as they disembarked. Like at Omaha, these men were at the mercy of German shooters who unleashed hundreds of rounds in a matter of seconds. It was such a slaughter that the Allies themselves had to move the bodies of their fallen comrades to advance and avoid being buried under Nazi lead. In total, 961 Allied soldiers died on Juno Beach, a significantly lower number than Omaha, but still painful. Canadian forces quickly cleared the beach and created 2 exits to the nearest inland towns. Although the delay in capturing Bagny-sur-Mer caused a bottleneck on the coast, by nightfall, the territory occupied by the Allies covered 19 kilometers in width and extended 7 kilometers inland. It was a dagger pointing straight at the heart of occupied Europe. On August 8, 1944, the Germans launched a counterattack with the intention of destroying the Allied troops. But this turned out to be a fatal decision. Due to calculation errors, 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were trapped, surrounded by enemies and the cold waters of northern France. Many were killed or captured by U.S. troops. According to the original plans, the main slaughter was supposed to occur on D-Day, June 6, 1944, but it ultimately happened later, in the interior of France.
The banks wearing their steel helmets while this terrific barrage goes on around us. In this barrage, we've got our 4.2-inch mortars, our field guns, our medium guns, all the guns of the fleet. The shells are whistling overhead now. Just listen to them.
It was at this stage of Operation Overlord that British casualties exceeded 80% of the estimates provided by the High Command. Churchill, engulfed in anguish, began to wonder if there would be an army left standing when the Allies reached Berlin. The most terrifying aspect was that among the primary causes of casualties was combat fatigue, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. On the Allied side, the number of cases was very high, with around 30,000 affected in just the 1st U.S. Army. In contrast, American and British military psychiatrists were perplexed by how so few German prisoners seemed to suffer from combat fatigue. Despite the intense bombings they had been enduring for some time, they suspected it was due to Nazi indoctrination, which began during adolescence. Nevertheless, the Reich's defenses were not sufficient to contain the power of the Allied advance.
This is the BBC Home Service. D-Day has come. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. On
August 15th, with a firm presence on French soil, the Allies launched an invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon. From that moment, their advance was virtually unstoppable. The German units lacked the equipment and energy to withstand the fury of hundreds of thousands of Allies, eager for revenge for so many defeats across Europe. On August 25th, the historic liberation of Paris took place, with Reich forces retreating through the Seine River Valley after a week, ending their occupation of the City of Lights. Thus, Operation Overlord concluded, and the first nail was driven into the coffin of Nazi Germany. From D-Day to August 21st, the Allies transported 2,052,299 men to northern France. The cost in lives of the Normandy campaign was very high for both sides. Between June 6th and the end of August, U.S. forces suffered 20,668 deaths. During the same period, the casualties for the 1st Canadian Army and the 2nd British Army were 15,995 and 9,054 missing, respectively. The losses among the German armed forces deployed in France were brutal, with 158,930 deaths recorded between D-Day and August 14th. In total, estimates of German casualties in the Normandy campaign, including dead, wounded, and captured, range between 400,000 and 600,000 troops. These were the terrified faces of those who survived that nightmare. The Normandy landing was the largest maritime invasion in history, involving nearly 5,000 landing craft, 289 escort ships, and 277 minesweepers. These figures highlight the commitment of the Allied nations to defeating their common enemy. By opening the new front requested by Stalin, the operation accelerated the end of World War II in Europe and led to the transfer of numerous German troops from the east. With the Russians to the east and the United States to the west, Hitler was caught between a rock and a hard place. Additionally, the defeat in France was a tremendous moral blow to the German army, which had long feared the repetition of another two-front war similar to World War I. The Allied victory in Normandy was due to several factors. First, the German defenses were not completed by the time of the invasion. Moreover, the diversionary maneuvers proved effective and forced the Germans to prepare defenses over a vast stretch of coast, diluting Hitler's forces. As a result, the Allies immediately achieved and maintained air superiority, preventing the Wehrmacht from monitoring preparations in Britain and utilizing the Luftwaffe to interfere with their development. The Wehrmacht also suffered from indecision and an excessively complex command structure, which further contributed to its ineffectiveness. Finally, the morale of the Allied soldiers was noteworthy. They came to Normandy knowing it was a pivotal moment in World War II. Hundreds of thousands of young men gave their lives without hesitation, and their efforts were rewarded with a victory that will forever remain in the history books. And so, we come to the end. If you are passionate about these topics and want to continue discovering the most important events of the 20th century, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel to stay updated on each of our releases. With that, we bid you farewell until the next military history video. Thank you for joining us.